In this week's lesson of imprisonment and reentry, we are going to discuss post-release supervision, or as it's more commonly known, parole. We're going to first look at the history and characteristics of parole. We'll then examine the articles I assigned by Mona Lynch that deal with research on the new penology and parole. We'll then discuss a parolee's view of supervision, an article I assigned that I wrote several years ago. We'll also analyze intensive parole and whether intensive parole is effective. And finally, we'll discuss conditions of parole, types of conditions of parole, and the historical trends in those conditions. The first topic I'd like to discuss is the history and characteristics of parole. And perhaps the easiest way to discuss parole is to contrast it with its other form of supervision, probation. Now, probation comes from the Latin word probare, or to prove. And the major distinction between probation and parole is that probation is given in lieu of incarceration, or instead of incarceration, while, as we'll see later, parole is typically given in addition to a period of incarceration. There are far more probationers in the United States than there are parolees. In 2010, there were roughly 4 million probationers on supervision in the U.S. Now, another important distinction between probation and parole is that the conditions of probation, the rules that a probationer must follow, are typically set by a judge at sentencing. As we'll see, parole conditions are set by paroling authorities. John Augustus is considered the father of probation. He was a Boston bootmaker, and in 1841 he began efforts to try to reform former criminals. He imposed a type of supervision, contracting with the state. It was the first form of probation. Probation was adopted nationally in the United States by 1967, and there was a federal probation statute in 1925. Now, conditions of probation and parole are very similar, and we'll discuss those in depth later in this lesson. Violations of those conditions and how those violations are enforced are different. For probation, a probationer who violates, who breaks a rule, goes back in front of the sentencing judge, back in front of the judge who set those conditions. And on a term of, say, 5 years of probation, that probationer can be resentenced to that entire term of probation as a term of incarceration. A violation of probation is a very serious matter in some instances. Now, as I mentioned, parole differs from probation in different ways. Parole is a French term, comes from the term parole d'honneur, and you'll have to pardon my accent, or lack thereof, which translates roughly to word of honor. Now, as I said, probation is typically given in lieu of incarceration, while parole is imposed in addition to incarceration. There may be a term of incarceration, say 3 or 5 years, and then an additional term of parole given after incarceration, say 2 or 3 years. There are fewer parolees in the United States than there are probationers. Recall there were roughly 4 million probationers in the United States as of 2010. As of 2010, there were approximately 850,000 parolees. Again, a major difference between the two is that for parole, conditions are set by paroling authorities, parole boards, administrative agencies set to establish conditions, but not the sentencing judge. It's typically a Department of Correction exercise. Alexander de Maconochie, an Australian prison superintendent, is widely considered the father of parole. He developed a system, a ticket of leave system, and a marks system, which was essentially an early form of parole. The U.S. first instituted parole in 1867 in Elmira, a prison that you're familiar with in that it was one of the first reformatory type prisons in the United States. Now again, conditions of probation and parole are very similar. The difference really is how violations occur. For parole, violations meaning that a parolee who has broken the rules must go back in front of paroling authorities. Typically is incarcerated on the spot depending on the violation, and then must see paroling authorities to determine how much time or what kind of a penalty that parolee is given. So just a quick word about this. If one's on parole, say for a term of a year, depending on the type of violation, that person can be resentenced to that entire year. Now, let me explain how that works. There are typically two types of parole violations: a new crime or a technical violation. A technical violation is a violation of parole where a parolee breaks a rule, but that behavior isn't otherwise illegal. So let's say, for instance, someone has an alcohol restriction as a parole restriction, and that parolee is caught drinking. They have committed a technical violation of parole. If they were not on parole, drinking would not be illegal, provided the parolee was over 21. Those technical violations almost always do not include taking that parolee's street time. So let's say a parolee has been on parole for 6 months, and that parolee has 1 year of parole to do, so they have 6 months left. If they're caught drinking, say in month 7, the paroling authorities typically cannot take the 6 months of, quote, clean time that parolee's already done. Now, if that parolee is caught committing a new crime, a violation of the law is a parole violation, he or she might be subject to having his, quote, street time taken, or the time that he's been behaving for the first 6 months he was on parole. Now, I know that can be a little confusing, and I'll put a question in the discussion board about it to hopefully try to clear it up. Now, both probation and parole try to accomplish two things, and they're widely known as the twin goals of probation and parole. Probation and parole are designed to, 1, protect the public, and to facilitate reintegration. Now, as you can imagine, these goals are often at a loggerhead. And what I mean by that is, to protect the public, probation and paroling authorities must impose certain rules. Well, those rules can sometimes be cumbersome for probationers and parolees. And given that they're cumbersome, and given that they limit the freedoms probationers and parolees have, they can sometimes hinder reintegration and reentry. For instance, a travel restriction, where a parolee or a probationer cannot leave the county. Though typically permission will be granted or can be asked for and likely will be granted if that parolee or probationer's job is outside the county, a probation officer or parole officer can say no, can say absolutely not, you cannot leave the county. Well, that's going to hinder their work opportunities. And that's just one example. You could probably think of several others where a rule of probation or parole, while it absolutely protects the public, does little to facilitate reintegration. And probably the opposite is true too. There are likely services and rules and assistance that probation officers and parole officers can offer parolees and probationers that put them in situations where potentially the public is more at risk. Now, just a quick note on sentence structures here. There are typically two types of sentences given: an indeterminate sentence or a determinate sentence. An indeterminate sentence is a sentence where you hear 5 to 10 years or 3 to 6 years. A determinate sentence is 1 term of years, 3 years, or 5 years. If there are multiple charges and multiple sentences, those sentences can run concurrent, meaning on top of one another, or consecutive, meaning one right after the other. So for instance, if someone is sentenced to, say, 2 3-year terms of imprisonment, 2 determinate 3-year terms, if they run concurrent, that person only needs to serve 3 years in prison. If they're run consecutive, or as we said in prison, if they're running wild, then that prisoner is going to have to serve 6 years in prison. Parole comes into play for all sentence structures. In an indeterminate sentence, say a 5 to 10, a prisoner might be parole eligible at 5. For a determinate sentence, say a sentence of 3 years, typically what a state or jurisdiction will do will include a term of parole after the sentence is served. California gives determinate sentences, and up until a few years ago required that everyone who leaves state prison serve a term of 3 years of parole following their incarceration. Now quickly, there are theories of parole, and there are 3. The first is the grace theory of parole, that by allowing someone to leave prison on supervision, the state is offering a measure of grace, a measure of leniency, and that the parolee owes the state something for that act of kindness. There's also the contract theory of parole, in that the state agrees to allow someone to go free, and in return, for valuable consideration, that parolee promises to follow several rules. The custody theory of parole is a little different. The custody theory of parole views parolees as still in the custody of the state. It views parolees as prisoners. Now, while these theories won't come into play all that much in this class, if you ever take a law of probation and parole class, you'll see that when due process rights are implicated and search and seizure rights are implicated for those on supervision, depending on which theory of parole you subscribe to, that's going to make a huge difference in how we analyze a due process claim or a search and seizure claim or a First Amendment claim, for instance.